Welcome to Soft Mystic Stories. 5,000 years ago, on a windswept plain in southern England, a group of people decided to do something that should have been impossible. They dragged stones weighing up to 25 tons across miles of open countryside, lifted them upright, and placed horizontal lintels on top, with a precision that modern engineers still struggle to explain. Some of those stones came from Wales, not from nearby Wales, from the Presley Hills in Pembrokeshire, over 150 miles away in a straight line. Closer to 200 miles if you follow any plausible overland route. These people had no metal tools, no wheels, no horses or oxmen capable of pulling loads like that. They didn't have writing. They didn't even have pottery when the earliest phases of Stonehenge began. And yet they built one of the most recognizable structures on the planet. Something so precisely aligned with the movements of the sun that it still marks the summer and winter solstices to this day. 5 millennia later, here is what most people think they know about Stonehenge. The Druids built it. The Celts used it. It was some kind of astronomical calendar, or a temple, or maybe both. And for centuries that story was good enough. It was simple. It made sense. The Celts arrived in Britain. They were spiritual people, connected to nature, and Stonehenge was their cathedral. But here is the problem with that story. It is completely fundamentally wrong. The Celts did not build Stonehenge. They didn't even arrive in Britain until roughly 750 BC at the earliest, and some scholars push that date even later. Stonehenge was already ancient by then. The main construction phases were completed around 2500 BC, which means the monument had been standing for nearly 2,000 years before the first Celtic-speaking people set foot on the Siva island. So if the Celts didn't build it, who did? The answer is a group of Neolithic farmers who arrived in Britain around 4000 BC, probably from what is now northern France. They were part of a wave of agricultural migration that swept across Europe from the Near East, bringing wheat, barley, cattle, and a completely new way of life to a continent that had been populated by hunter-gatherers for thousands of years. These farmers didn't just build Stonehenge, they built hundreds of monuments across the British Isles, long barrows, cursus monuments, hennes, stone circles. They transformed the landscape in ways that are still visible today. And then, around 2400 BC, they vanished. Not gradually, not over centuries of slow cultural change. The DNA evidence published in a landmark 2018 study by researchers at Harvard and the Natural History Museum in London tells a story that is far more dramatic than anyone expected. Within just a few generations, the genetic signature of the Neolithic farming population was almost completely replaced. The people who had built Stonehenge, who had lived in Britain for over 1,000 years, who had created one of the most sophisticated ritual landscapes in prehistoric Europe, were gone, replaced by a new population from continental Europe, a people archaeologists called the Beaker folk. And the original builders, nobody knows where they went. Nobody knows if they migrated, died out, were absorbed, or something worse. Their DNA just disappears from the record. This is the story of the people who built Stonehenge, who they were, where they came from, what they believed, and the unsettling mystery of what happened to them. If you want to understand how a civilization can vanish and leave behind nothing but stones, subscribe to this channel. We cover the histories that nobody else is willing to tell. Hit subscribe and let's get into it. To understand Stonehenge, you first have to forget almost everything you think you know about it. Start with the name itself. Set Stonehenge is an Old English word, and it literally means hanging stones or stone gallows. The Anglo-Saxons who coined it arrived in Britain around the 5th century AD, roughly 3,000 years after the monument was built. They had no idea who had put it there. They just saw these massive stones hanging in the air, lintels resting on uprights like some kind of ancient execution frame, and named it accordingly. The monument sits on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, about 8 miles north of the city of Salisbury. Today it looks like a lonely circle of stones in the middle of flat grassland surrounded by a rope barrier and a constant stream of tourists. But that image is misleading in almost every way. Stonehenge was never meant to be seen in isolation. It was part of a vast ritual landscape that stretched for miles in every direction. Within walking distance of the stone circle, there are hundreds of burial mounds, several henges, a massive wooden structure called Woodhenge, a colossal settlement at Durrington Walls, long barrows that predate the stone circle by centuries, and a recently discovered network of buried shafts, arranged in a circle over a mile wide. Stonehenge was the centerpiece of something enormous, something that took generations to build, and was clearly the focus of an entire civilization's spiritual life. The stones themselves come in two distinct types. The larger ones are sass, a type of silicified sandstone that occurs naturally on the chalk, downlands of southern England. The biggest sarsen at Stonehenge, the heel stone, weighs about 35 tons. The stones of the outer circle weigh around 25 tons each. And the 5 massive trilithons, the sets of 2 uprights, capped by a lintel that form the inner horseshoe, include stones weighing up to 45 tons. For decades, archaeologists assumed these sass came from the Marlborough Downs about 25 miles to the north. In 2020, a geochemical study confirmed that most of them came from a specific area called West Woods, near the village of Lockage. 25 miles doesn't sound far, but try dragging a 25-ton rock across chalk downland with no roads, no wheels, and no draft animals powerful enough for the job. The smaller stones are the blue stones, and their story is even more extraordinary. Blue stones are a general term for several types of igneous and volcanic rock, including duarite, rhyite, and volcanic ash. They weigh between 2 and 5 tons each, and they come from the Presley Hills in southwest Wales. The distance from the Presley Hills to Stonehenge is about 150 miles as the crow flies. The actual transport route, whether by land, sea, river, or some combination, would have been considerably longer. For over a century, geologists have debated how the blue stones got to Westbury Plain. The two main theories are human transport and glacial transport. The glacial theory suggests that Ice Age glaciers carried the stones from Wales to somewhere in southern England, and the Neolithic people simply collected them from wherever the glaciers had deposited them. The human transport theory says the builders deliberately quarried the stones in Wales and hauled them to Wiltshire, presumably because those specific stones had some kind of sacred significance. Recent excavations at 2 quarry sites in the Precelli Hills, Codog and Craig Rossi Phelan, have essentially settled this debate. The quarries show clear evidence of human extraction. There are stone platforms where pillars were leveled out, stone wedge holes where the rock was split, and a prepared loading platform where the extracted stones could be placed onto some kind of sledge or raft. Radiocarbon dates from the quarry sites suggest the blue stones were extracted around 3000 BC, which aligns perfectly with the early phases of Stonehenge. So, the builders went to Wales, quarried specific stones, and brought them back to Wiltshire. The question of why they chose those particular stones from that particular location remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of British prehistory. Were the stones sacred? Was there a pre-existing stone circle in Wales that they dismantled and moved? Was there a cultural or ancestral connection between the Stonehenge builders and the people of Precelli? We will come back to these questions later, because recent DNA evidence has opened up some fascinating possibilities. The construction of Stonehenge happened in several phases, spanning roughly 1,000 years from about 3000 BC to 2000 BC. The earliest structure was simply a circular ditch and bank, a henge in the technical sense, with a ring of pits inside it, called the Aubrey Holes. The Aubrey Holes may have held timber posts originally, and there is evidence that they were later used for cremation burials. This earliest phase of Stonehenge was essentially a cremation cemetery, a place where the dead were brought from across a wide area to be buried within the sacred circle. Around 2500 BC, the monument was dramatically transformed. This is when the Sasson stones were erected, the famous circle and trilithons that defined the monument's silhouette. The blue stones were rearranged. The avenue was constructed, connecting the monument to the river Avon about 1.5 miles to the northeast, and the entire landscape was reorganized around the stone circle. The engineering involved was remarkable by any standard. The Sasson uprights were shaped using stone moles, round hammerstones that the builders used to pound the surface until it was smooth. Each upright has a tenant on top, a protruding knob of stone that fits into a corresponding mortise, a carved socket on the underside of the lintel. This is a woodworking technique applied to stone, which tells us something important about these builders. They were accustomed to building large structures in timber, and when they switched to stone, they brought their carpentry techniques with them. The lintels of the outer circle are joined to each other with tongue and groove joints. Another technique borrowed from woodworking. The entire circle was designed so that the tops of the lintels form a level ring, even though the ground slopes slightly. This means the uprights are different heights, carefully calculated so that the lintels sit flat despite the uneven terrain. The precision is extraordinary, and it required a level of planning and mathematical understanding that we don't usually associate with prehistoric people. But here is something that often gets overlooked. The technical achievement of Stonehenge is impressive, but it is not unique. Similar megalithic construction was happening across Atlantic Europe during the same period. Newgrange in Ireland, built around 3200 BC, has a passage aligned with the winter solstice sunrise. The Carnac stones in Brittany include over 3,000 standing stones, arranged in rows stretching for miles. The Ring of Brodgar in Orne, the Callanish stones on Lewis, Michaud, Scarab, the British Isles, and the Atlantic coast of Europe were covered in megalithic monuments during the Neolithic period. Stonehenge was the grandest of them, but it was part of a much larger tradition. What made Stonehenge special was not just its scale, but its longevity. The site was used, modified, and rebuilt over more than 1,000 years. It was not a single building project. It was a living monument, constantly being reimagined by successive generations. And understanding that timeline is crucial to understanding who built it and what happened to them. Before the first stone was ever placed at Stonehenge, before the ditch was dug or the first cremation burial deposited, Britain was a very different place. And to understand the people who eventually built the monument, you need to understand the world they walked into. The last ice age ended around 10,000 BC. For tens of thousands of years before that, much of Britain had been buried under ice sheets up to a mile thick. When the ice retreated, it left behind a landscape of bare rock, glacial debris, and meltwater. But nature moved fast. Within a few thousand years, the tundra gave way to birch and pine forests, and those forests gave way to dense broadleaf woodland, dominated by oak, elm, hazel, and lime. By 8000 BC, Britain was covered in wildwood from coast to coast, a primeval forest so thick that in some areas the canopy blocked out almost all sunlight, and people were living in it. The Mesolithic people, the Middle Stone Age hunter-gatherers, had been present in Britain since at least 9000 BC, and possibly earlier. They lived in small, mobile bands, moving with the seasons to follow game and harvest wild plants. They hunted red deer, roe deer, wild boar, and aurochs, the massive wild cattle that were the ancestors of domesticated breeds. They fished in rivers and along the coast. They gathered hazelnuts, berries, roots, and wild grains. These were not primitive people stumbling through the forest. The Neolithic population of Britain was sophisticated, adaptable, and deeply knowledgeable about their environment. They made microliths, tiny stone blades that were hafted into composite tools. They built boats, capable of crossing the English Channel and the Irish Sea. They managed the forest with deliberate burning, clearing patches of woodland to encourage new growth and attract grazing animals. And here is the remarkable thing. There is evidence of Neolithic activity at the Stonehenge site itself. Thousands of years before the monument was built, in the 1960s, during excavations in the Stonehenge car park, archaeologists discovered 3 large pits that had once held massive timber posts. These posts, each made from a tree trunk about 2.5 feet in diameter, were erected sometime between 8500 and 7000 BC. That is roughly 4,000 years before the first phase of Stonehenge. Nobody knows what they were for. They may have been totem poles, territorial markers, or part of some kind of ceremonial structure. but their presence tells us that this particular spot on Salisbury Plain held significance for people long before anyone thought of putting stones there. Salisbury Plain itself would have looked very different in the Mesolithic. Today it is open grassland, the largest area of chalk downland in Britain, maintained by military use and sheep grazing. In the Mesolithic, it was forested like everywhere else, but the chalk soil of the plains supported a thinner, more open woodland than the heavy clay soils of the surrounding lowlands. The forest would have been lighter here, with more clearings, more grass, more opportunities for grazing animals. It was a natural gathering point in the landscape, a place where different groups could meet. The English Channel was not yet a channel in the early Mesolithic. Britain was still connected to continental Europe by a land bridge called Dogland, a low-lying plain that occupied much of what is now the North Sea. Dogland was not some narrow strip of land. It was a vast, inhabited landscape, larger than many modern European countries, with its own rivers, lakes, forests, and human populations. The people living in Britain during the Mesolithic were not islanders. They were part of a continuous population that stretched from Ireland to Scandinavia. Around 6,500 BC, rising sea levels finally severed the land bridge. Britain became an island. The people already living there were cut off from the continent, though they continued to maintain contact through boat travel across the Channel and the North Sea. This isolation would become important later because the arrival of farming in Britain was significantly delayed compared to the rest of Europe, and part of the reason may have been the simple physical barrier of the sea. The Mesolithic people of Britain lived this way for thousands of years. Generation after generation, they hunted, fished, gathered, burned the forest, moved with the seasons, and left almost nothing behind except their stone tools and the occasional post hole. Their population was small, probably never more than a few thousand people across the entire island. They had no permanent settlements, no pottery, no agriculture, but they knew every inch of their landscape, every river crossing, every animal trail, every stand of hazel that would produce nuts in autumn. And then around 4000 BC, everything changed. The arrival of farming in Britain is one of the most important transitions in the island's history, and for decades, archaeologists argued about how it happened. There were two competing models. The first, called the indigenous adoption model, suggested that the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Britain gradually learned farming techniques from contact with agricultural communities across the Channel. They adopted crops and livestock, settled down, and became farmers themselves. The existing population transformed, but the people stayed the same. The second model, called the migration model, suggested that new people arrived from continental Europe, bringing farming with them. These migrants either replaced the existing hunter-gatherer population or absorbed them through intermarriage and cultural assimilation. For most of the 20th century, the indigenous adoption model was dominant in British archaeology. The idea of mass migration was associated with outdated racial theories and the kind of simplistic invasion narratives that archaeologists were trying to move beyond. The prevailing view was that cultures change, but populations remain, that the spread of farming was a spread of ideas and techniques, not a movement of people. Then came ancient DNA analysis, and the picture changed dramatically. In 2019, a major study published in Nature Ecology and Evolution analyzed the genomes of dozens of Neolithic individuals from across Britain. The results were unambiguous. The Neolithic farming population of Britain was genetically distinct from the preceding Mesolithic population. The farmers showed strong genetic affinities with Neolithic populations from Iberia and western France, particularly from regions like Brittany and the Atlantic coast. The Mesolithic contribution to their gene pool was minimal, typically less than 10%. In other words, the first farmers in Britain were not converted hunter-gatherers. They were immigrants. They came from across the sea, probably in small boats, carrying seed, grain, livestock, and their families. They didn't learn to farm from their neighbors. They brought farming with them. The transition happened relatively quickly by prehistoric standards. By 3800 BC, Farming communities were established across southern England, and by 3500 BC, agriculture had spread to Scotland, Ireland, and the islands. The wheat, barley, cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs that sustained these communities were all species that did not exist wild in Britain. Every single one had to be imported from the continent. These early farmers cleared the forest. They used fire and stone axes to create fields, and the pollen record shows dramatic changes in vegetation across Britain after 4000 BC. Oak and elm declined sharply. Grasses and cereal pollens appeared. The ancient wildwood that had covered Britain for millennia began to shrink, and the open, pastoral landscape that we associate with the British countryside today started to take shape. The impact on the Mesolithic population is less clear. The DNA evidence suggests they were largely replaced, but replaced is a word that covers a wide range of possibilities. The hunter-gatherers may have been absorbed into the farming communities through intermarriage, with their genetic contribution diluted over generations. They may have been pushed into marginal areas, surviving for a time in upland forests and coastal zones where farming was impractical. They may have died out from diseases brought by the newcomers, similar to what happened to indigenous populations in the Americas millennia later. Or there may have been conflict, though direct evidence for violent displacement has not been found. What we do know is that within a few centuries of the farmers' arrival, the Mesolithic way of life in Britain was essentially over. The hunter-gatherers who had lived on the island for over 5,000 years were replaced by a completely different population with a completely different culture, and it is this new population, these Neolithic farmers from the continent, who would go on to build Stonehenge. The Neolithic farmers who arrived in Britain around 4000 BC did not waste time. Within a few generations, they began building monuments on a scale that still astonishes archaeologists today. The earliest of these monuments were long barrows, elongated earthen mounds used for communal burial. Long barrows are found across southern and eastern England, and they represent the oldest surviving human-made structures in the British landscape. Some of them are enormous. West Kennet Long Barrow in Wiltshire, built around 3650 BC, is over 100 meters long. Its stone chambers contained the remains of at least 46 individuals deposited over a period of several centuries. The bones were not simply buried and left. They were periodically rearranged, sorted, and moved around. Skulls were separated from bodies. Long bones were grouped together. The dead were not treated as individuals to be interred and forgotten. They were treated as communal ancestors, their bones forming a kind of sacred collection that belonged to the entire community. This practice tells us something profound about how these people saw themselves. They were not a society of individuals. They were a society of ancestors. The living existed in relationship to the dead, and the dead were not gone. They were present, available, powerful. The long barrows were not just tombs. They were places where the living went to commune with the dead, to seek their guidance, to draw on their authority. And the construction effort was enormous. Building a long barrow required clearing land, quarrying stone or cutting turf, digging ditches, raising mounds, constructing stone or timber chambers. These were not projects that a single family could complete. They required coordinated labor from dozens or hundreds of people working together, over weeks or months. The fact that these monuments appear so early in the Neolithic settlement of Britain tells us that these farming communities were organized, motivated, and capable of large-scale collective action from the very beginning. The next type of monument to appear was the cursus, a long, narrow enclosure defined by parallel banks and ditches. The greater cursus near Stonehenge is about 3 kilometers long and 100 meters wide. It was built around 3500 BC, roughly 500 years before the first phase of Stonehenge. The name cursus was given by the 18th century antiquarian William Stuckley, who thought it looked like a Roman chariot racecourse. It was almost certainly nothing of the sort. Cursus monuments may have been processional avenues, ceremonial pathways connecting important points in the landscape. They are aligned with features like long barrows, river crossings, and prominent hills. Walking through a cursus would have been a journey through a landscape loaded with meaning, every sightline and turning point deliberately chosen. The third major monument type was the causeway enclosure, a roughly circular area surrounded by one or more rings of interrupted ditches. The causeways, the gaps in the ditches, are the defining feature. These were not defensive fortifications. The ditches were often dug in segments that don't quite connect, which would make them useless for keeping anyone out. Instead, they seem to have been gathering places, locations where people from scattered, farming communities came together at certain times of the year for feasting, exchange, and ritual. Animal bones, pottery, and human remains are commonly found in the ditches, suggesting that causeway enclosures were places of ceremony and communal activity. Windmill Hill in Wiltshire, one of the largest causeway enclosures in Britain, was constructed around 3700 BC. It sits about 25 miles north of Stonehenge near Abury. Excavations have revealed deposits of cattle bone, pottery, flint tools, and human remains in the ditches, along with fragments of stone axes that came from as far away as Cumbria and Cornwall. This tells us that the Neolithic communities of southern England were not isolated farming villages. They were connected to a network of exchange and communication that spanned hundreds of miles. These are the people who built Stonehenge. Not a single tribe or chieftain, a widespread agricultural civilization with a shared culture of monument building, ancestor worship, communal labor, and long-distance trade. They had been in Britain for nearly 1,000 years before they began constructing the stone circle, and during that millennium they had transformed the landscape, established complex social structures, and developed a sophisticated understandings of astronomy, engineering, and ritual practice. By the time the first ditch was dug at Stonehenge around 3000 BC, these farmers already had 1,000 years of monument-building experience behind them. Stonehenge was not a sudden inspiration. It was the culmination of a long tradition. The earliest phase of Stonehenge, known as Stonehenge I, began around 30,000 BC. It was modest compared to what came later, but it was significant in ways that took archaeologists decades to fully appreciate. The first construction was a circular ditch with an internal bank roughly 110 meters in diameter. The ditch was not continuous. It was dug in segments like a causeway enclosure, with narrow gaps between the sections. This is unusual for a henge, a term that technically refers to a circular earthwork with a ditch inside the bank. At most hennes, the ditch is inside the bank, which means the bank is not defensive. You don't put your defensive barrier on the wrong side of the ditch. The design tells us immediately that hennes were ritual structures, not fortifications. Whatever was happening inside was being separated from the outside world, but not protected from attack. Inside the bank, the builders dug a ring of 56 pits, arranged in a circle about 86 meters in diameter. These are the Aubrey holes, named after the 17th century antiquary John Aubrey, who first recorded them. For a long time, nobody knew what the Aubrey holes were for. Some researchers suggested they held timber posts. Others thought they might have been used for some kind of astronomical calculation, counting cycles of the sun and moon. The answer turned out to be simpler and more profound than either of those theories. The Aubrey holes were burial pits. Excavations in the early 20th century found cremated human bone in many of the holes, but the excavators at the time did not think the cremations were important. They rearranged the bones in one of the holes and moved on. In 2008, a team led by Mike Parker Pearson of University College London re-excavated the reburied remains and subjected them to modern analysis. The results were stunning. The Aubrey holes contained the cremated remains of at least 63 individuals deposited over a period of about 500 years, from roughly 3000 BC to 2500 BC. The earliest deposits were among the earliest datable activity at the site. Stonehenge in its first phase was a cremation cemetery. This changes our understanding of the monument fundamentally. Before the sars and stones, before the astronomical alignments, before any of the features that make Stonehenge visually spectacular, the site was a place of the dead. People from across the region brought their cremated remains here to be buried within the sacred circle. The site was chosen not for its views or its geology, but for its relationship to the dead. And those dead people were not just local farmers. Strontium isotope analysis of some of the cremated bones suggests that at least some of the individuals buried at Stonehenge had spent part of their lives in a different geological region, possibly Wales. This is significant because it connects Stonehenge to the Preseli Hills before the blue stones were even erected. The relationship between Stonehenge and Wales may go back to the very beginning, rooted not in stone but in people. A study published in 2019 analyzed the strontium isotope ratios of cremated remains from the Aubrey holes and found that about 40% of the individuals tested showed signatures consistent with living in Western Britain, potentially Wales. If these individuals grew up in Wales, were cremated after death, and then had their remains transported to Stonehenge for burial, then Stonehenge was functioning as a kind of national cemetery, a sacred place that drew people from across a wide territory. This is a crucial insight. Stonehenge was not a local monument built by a local community. It was a regional or even national monument, a focal point for people from across southern Britain and beyond. The effort of building it and the significance of being buried there suggests a level of social organization and shared identity that goes far beyond what we might expect from scattered farming communities. Around 2500 BC, Stonehenge was transformed. The modest cremation cemetery, with its ditch and Aubrey holes, was reimagined on a colossal scale. The sarsen stones were brought from the Marlborough Downs, roughly 25 miles to the north, and erected in the configuration that we recognize today. The outer circle of 30 sarsen uprights, capped with a continuous ring of lintels. The inner horseshoe of 5 trilithons, each consisting of 2 massive uprights supporting a single lintel. The tallest of these trilithons would have stood over 7 meters high, and the largest stone, stone 56, weighs an estimated 45 tons. The logistics of this project are staggering. Each sarsen stone had to be quarried, shaped, transported 25 miles across open country, and erected in a precisely planned position. The shaping alone was a monumental task. The builders used sarsen moles, fist-sized balls of hard sarsen stone, to pound and grind the surface of each stone until it was smooth. Experimental archaeology suggests that shaping a single upright could have taken months of continuous work. Transport is where the real questions begin. 25 miles across, rolling chalk downland, with stones weighing up to 45 tons, using no wheels, no metal tools, and no draft animals capable of pulling that kind of weight. The most widely accepted theory is that the stones were placed on wooden sledges and dragged over greased rollers or along prepared trackways, hauled by hundreds of people, pulling on ropes made of twisted plant fiber. Experiments have shown that a team of about 200 people could move a 25-ton stone on a sledge at a rate of about 1 mile per day under favorable conditions. At that rate, moving a single stone from the Marlborough Downs to Stonehenge would have taken roughly a month. There were at least 75 sarsen stones at the monument originally. Even if multiple stones were moved simultaneously, the transport phase alone would have represented years of organized labor. The erection of the stones required equally sophisticated engineering. Each upright was placed in a pit, dug into the chalk with one sloping side. The stone was likely dragged to the edge of the pit, tipped in using ropes and levers, and then hauled upright by a team of workers pulling on ropes, while others packed the base with chalk rubble and stone wedges to hold it in place. The lintels were raised to the top of the uprights using some kind of platform, either a timber scaffolding or a series of stacked cribs, raised incrementally by levering the lintel up and placing timbers underneath. The joints are what really set Stonehenge apart. The mortise and tenon joints on the uprights and lintels, and the tongue and groove joints connecting adjacent lintels, are techniques borrowed directly from timber construction. These builders were experienced carpenters who adapted their woodworking skills to stone. The joints were carved with incredible precision, and they served a practical purpose. Without them, the lintels would have been far more likely to shift or fall off the uprights over time. The fact that many of the lintels have remained in place for 4,500 years is a testament to the quality of the joinery. The blue stones were rearranged during this phase, placed in a circle inside the Sasson circle, and in an oval inside the trilithon horseshoe. Some of them show evidence of having been shaped and worked with lintels and tongue and groove, joints similar to those on the seisons. This suggests that the blue stones may have originally been set up in a trilithon arrangement of their own, perhaps at an earlier site, before being dismantled and brought to Stonehenge. The avenue was also constructed during this phase, a ceremonial pathway defined by parallel banks and ditches that runs from the northeast entrance of the stone circle down a gentle slope to the river about 1.5 miles away. The avenue is aligned with the midsummer sunrise and the mid-winter sunset, and its route follows a series of natural periglacial striations in the chalk, parallel ridges and grooves created by freezing and thawing at the end of the last ice age. These natural features happen to point toward the solstice sunrise, and some researchers believe that this natural alignment may have been one of the reasons the site was originally chosen. The alignment with the solstices is the most famous feature of Stonehenge, and it is real. On the morning of the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the sun rises over the hillstone at the entrance to the avenue and shines directly into the heart of the monument. On the evening of the winter solstice, the shortest day, the sun sets between the uprights of the largest trilithon. The alignment is precise enough that it cannot be coincidental. It was designed, but what did the solstice alignments mean to the builders? This is where we enter the realm of interpretation, and interpretations vary widely. Some researchers see Stonehenge as primarily an astronomical observatory, a tool for tracking the movements of the sun and moon. Others see the solstice alignment as primarily symbolic, marking the turning points of the year in a culture whose survival depended on the seasons. The winter solstice, the day when the sun reaches its lowest point and begins to climb again, may have been the most important day in the Neolithic calendar, a day of renewal and rebirth. Mike Parker Pearson, one of the leading Stonehenge researchers, has proposed that the monument was specifically associated with the dead and the winter solstice. His theory, developed over 2 decades of fieldwork, suggests that Stonehenge was part of a pair. The stone circle represented the domain of the ancestors, the dead, permanence. Durrington Walls, the massive timber and earthwork complex 2 miles to the northeast, represented the domain of the living, feasting, celebration. The winter solstice was the moment when the 2 domains connected, when the living gathered at Durrington Walls to feast, and then processed along the Haven and up the avenue to Stonehenge to commune with the dead. It is a compelling theory, and it fits much of the evidence, but it remains a theory. The builders left no written records, no inscriptions, no explanations. We are reading their intentions from the orientation of stones and the distribution of animal bones. We may be right, we may be completely wrong. The honest answer is that we don't know what Stonehenge meant to the people who built it. We only know that it mattered enough for them to invest centuries of effort in constructing and maintaining it. 2 miles northeast of Stonehenge, on a rise overlooking the River Avon, there is a site that most visitors to the area never see. It is not as photogenic as the stone circle. There are no standing stones, no dramatic silhouettes against the sky, just a field of rough grass with some subtle bumps and hollows in the surface. But Durrington Walls is arguably more important to our understanding of Stonehenge than the stone circle itself. Because Durrington Walls is where the builders lived. Durrington Walls is a massive henge enclosure, one of the largest in Britain. The ditch, now mostly filled in, was originally about 5.5 meters deep and 18 meters wide. The bank stood over 3 meters high. The enclosed area is roughly 500 meters in diameter, large enough to contain more than 17 football pitches. Inside the enclosure, excavations have revealed the remains of hundreds of timber post holes, the floors of numerous houses, and enormous quantities of animal bone and broken pottery. This was not a permanent settlement. It was a gathering place, somewhere people came from across the region at certain times of the year to feast, celebrate, and participate in the construction and rituals of Stonehenge. The evidence for feasting is spectacular. Excavations led by Mike Parker Pearson between 2004 and 2007 recovered over 38,000 animal bones from the site, mostly pig, with some cattle. The pigs were predominantly slaughtered at 9 months old, which corresponds to a mid-winter kill if the piglets were born in spring. Many of the bones showed signs of having been roasted whole over open fires, then discarded in large dumps. This was not subsistence farming, this was barbecue on an industrial scale. The pottery found at Dorrington Walls is grooved ware, a distinctive style of flat-bottomed, bucket-shaped pottery, decorated with grooved patterns. Grooved ware is found across Britain in the late Neolithic, and it is almost exclusively associated with ceremonial sites, hens, and high-status locations. Its presence at Dorrington Walls tells us that the gatherings here were not ordinary. They were special occasions, charged with ritual significance. The houses at Dorrington Walls were small, roughly square structures, built from timber with central hearths and plaster floors. They are remarkably similar in plan to the stone houses at Scarborough in Ornay, which has led some researchers to suggest that there was a standardized form of Neolithic architecture used across Britain, adapted to whatever building materials were locally available. The houses at Dorrington Walls were not lived in for long periods. Many of them show evidence of only 1 or 2 episodes of use before being abandoned. They were built for specific gatherings and then left to decay. The route between Dorrington Walls and Stonehenge followed a processional pathway. From the southern entrance of the Dorrington Walls enclosure, a short avenue led down to the River Avon. From there, the route followed the river downstream for about a mile before reaching the bottom of the Stonehenge Avenue, which climbed uphill to the Stone Circle. The entire journey was about 2.5 miles, and every section of it was marked, defined, and made ceremonial by earthworks. Parker Pearson's interpretation of this route is elegant. The journey from Dorrington Walls to Stonehenge was a journey from life to death. The timber structures at Dorrington Walls represented the world of the living, temporary, organic, bustling with noise and feasting. The stone circle at Stonehenge represented the world of the dead, permanent, silent, cold. The river was the boundary between the two worlds, and crossing it was a symbolic passage from one realm to the other. The winter solstice, when the sun dies and is reborn, was the moment when this transition was enacted. This is why Stonehenge faces the mid-winter sunset. Parker Pearson argues it was not about the summer solstice at all. The midsummer sunrise alignment, which is the one most people associate with Stonehenge, was actually secondary. The primary alignment was with the mid-winter sunset, the moment when the sun goes down on the shortest day and the longest night begins. The monument was oriented toward death, toward the end, toward the ancestors. The midsummer sunrise was simply the reverse view along the same axis. Whether or not you accept Parker Pearson's full interpretation, the relationship between Dorrington Walls and Stonehenge is undeniable. These two sites were built by the same people at the same time as complementary parts of a single, ceremonial complex. You cannot understand one without the other. The stone circle was not an isolated wonder. It was the sacred heart of a living, breathing community that gathered seasonally to feast, worship, build, and honor their dead. Stonehenge was not alone on Salisbury Plain, and it was not even the largest monument in the region. 10 mi to the north, the Abery complex represents an even more ambitious construction project, built by the same Neolithic culture in roughly the same period. The stone circle at Avery is the largest in Europe. It is so large that the medieval village of Abery was built inside it, and the modern road passes through it. The outer circle, defined by a massive ditch and bank, is about 420 meters in diameter. The ditch alone is 9 meters deep and 21 meters wide, carved into solid chalk with antler picks and shoulder blade shovels. It has been estimated that the ditch at Avery required the removal of around 200,000 cubic meters of chalk, a project that would have taken hundreds of workers years to complete. Inside the outer circle are 2 smaller stone circles, and at the center of each was a particularly large stone or stone setting. An avenue of paired standing stones leads from the southern entrance of Avery down to a site called the Sanctuary. a series of concentric timber and stone rings on Overton Hill, about 1.5 miles to the southeast. Another avenue, now largely destroyed, led west from Avery toward a site called Beckham. Silbury Hill, the largest prehistoric artificial mound in Europe, sits less than 1 mile south of Avery. It stands 40 meters high and covers over 5 acres at its base. It contains over 250,000 cubic meters of chalk and earth. It was built in stages, probably around 2400 BC, and nobody has any idea what it was for. There is no burial chamber inside. Multiple excavations, including tunnels driven through the center of the mound in the 18th and 19th centuries, have found nothing at the core except the stacked chalk and turf blocks used to build it. Silbury Hill remains one of the most perplexing monuments in Europe, a structure of extraordinary ambition and effort with no apparent purpose that we can identify. West Kennet Long Barrow, one of the largest Neolithic tombs in Britain, lies just south of Silbury Hill, and scattered across the surrounding landscape are hundreds of smaller monuments, round barrows, standing stones, enclosures, and field systems that together form one of the densest concentrations of prehistoric remains anywhere in the world. The Avery complex and the Stonehenge complex were connected. They were built by the same broad culture, using the same techniques, driven by the same beliefs. The Sasson stones at both Stonehenge and Avery came from the same source area near the Marlborough Downs. The people who quarried the Sass and dragged them to their respective monuments may have been the same communities, working on different projects in different years, but there are differences. Avery is rougher, less precise. The stones are unshaped, left in their natural form, driven into the ground as found. There are no lintels, no joinery, no carefully calculated levels. Avery is about mass, about scale, about the sheer weight of stone sunk into the earth. Stonehenge is about precision, about engineering, about lifting stones into the sky. Together, they represent the two poles of Neolithic monumental ambition. Ivory goes wide, Stonehenge goes high, and both of them were built by people who within a few centuries would vanish from the genetic record of Britain. The Neolithic builders of Stonehenge were not just engineers and laborers, they were people with a rich inner life, a complex relationship with the natural world, and beliefs about death, the sun, and the cycle of the seasons that drove them to reshape the landscape on a massive scale. We know very little about their religion in specific terms. They left no texts, no images that can be clearly interpreted as depictions of gods or rituals, no mythology that survived into recorded history. But we can make some inferences from the monuments themselves and from the patterns of what was deposited in them. Death was central. The earliest monuments, the long barrows, were communal tombs. The hens, including the early phase of Stonehenge, contained cremation burials. The causeway enclosures where the living gathered also contained deposits of human bone. The dead were not hidden away. They were present in the landscape, embedded in the monuments, integral to the places where communal life happened. This suggests a belief system in which the boundary between the living and the dead was permeable. The ancestors were not gone. They were there, in the stones, in the earth, in the orientation of the monuments, toward the rising and setting sun. The long barrows were revisited over centuries, bones removed and rearranged, skulls taken out and placed in new deposits. The dead were not buried once and forgotten. They were curated, maintained, visited. They were part of the ongoing life of the community. The sun was also central, though its exact significance is debated. The solstice alignments at Stonehenge, New Grange, and Michaud in Ornay tell us that the movements of the sun were tracked, understood, and incorporated into the design of major monuments. The winter solstice, the shortest day, seems to have been particularly important. At New Grange, the rising sun on the winter solstice sends a beam of light down a narrow passage and illuminates the inner chamber for about 17 minutes. At Mayo, the setting sun on the winter solstice shines down the entrance passage. At Stonehenge, the mid-winter sunset aligns with the main axis of the monument. All three of these alignments point to the same idea. The winter solstice, the moment when the sun reaches its lowest point and begins to return, was a day of profound significance. It may have been understood as a death and rebirth of the sun, a turning point in the cosmic cycle, a moment when the world hung in the balance between darkness and light. The monuments that mark this moment were the most important structures these people built, the places where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was thinnest. There is also evidence for a concern with fertility and the cycles of nature. The grooved ware pottery found at late Neolithic ceremonial sites is often associated with pig bones, suggesting feasting. Pigs reproduce quickly and in large litters, and they may have carried symbolic associations with abundance and fertility. Cattle bones, by contrast, are more common at causeway enclosures and earlier Neolithic sites. The shift from cattle to pig in ceremonial deposits may reflect changing beliefs or changing social structures during the Neolithic. Stone axes, which were essential tools for forest clearance and construction, also had a ceremonial role. Some axes were made from stone sources hundreds of miles from where they were deposited, polished to a mirror finish, and clearly never used for practical purposes. They were prestige objects, gifts, offerings. Axes from the great Langdale axe factories in the Lake District are found across southern England. Axes made of Cornish greenstone turn up in Wiltshire. Axes made of alpine jade from sources in the Italian and Swiss Alps have been found in Britain. These objects were traded or exchanged over enormous distances, and their presence at monument sites suggest that the exchange networks themselves had a sacred dimension. The builders of Stonehenge lived in a world saturated with meaning. Every feature of the landscape, every alignment, every deposit of bone or stone or pottery was laden with significance. They did not draw a line between the practical and the sacred, between agriculture and religion, between the daily work of farming and the cosmic cycles of the sun. Everything was connected, and the monuments they built were the physical expression of those connections. Now we come to the part of this story that changed everything, the part that took a century of careful archaeological interpretation and flipped it upside down. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model in British archaeology was cultural continuity. The idea was simple. People stayed put. Cultures changed. Technologies evolved. Pottery styles came and went. But the underlying population of Britain remained fundamentally the same from the Neolithic onward. The arrival of the Bronze Age around 2200 BC was understood as a cultural shift, not a population replacement. New ideas, new technologies, new artistic styles diffused across the Channel from continental Europe and were adopted by the existing population. The same people, different stuff. This model was partly a reaction to the excesses of earlier archaeology, which had attributed every change in the material record to an invasion or a migration. The invasion hypothesis had been used to explain the arrival of the Celts, the Beaker culture, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and practically every other transition in British prehistory. By the 1960s and 1970s, archaeologists were tired of invasions. They wanted explanations that didn't require constantly inventing new waves of migrants. They wanted to give agency to the people already living in Britain, rather than always crediting outsiders for change. The problem is that the cultural continuity model was wrong. Not entirely wrong. Not wrong about everything, but wrong about the big picture, in ways that ancient DNA has now made undeniable. The ancient DNA revolution in archaeology began in earnest in the 2010s when advances in sequencing technology made it possible to extract and analyze genetic material from human bones thousands of years old. Previous attempts at ancient DNA had been plagued by contamination, limited to mitochondrial DNA, and restricted to a handful of samples. The new techniques, particularly the ability to extract DNA from the petrous bone of the inner ear, which preserves genetic material better than any other part of the skeleton, opened up entire populations to genetic analysis. In 2015, a massive study published in Nature analyzed the genomes of 69 ancient Europeans and showed that the populations of Europe had been reshaped by a major migration from the Eurasian steppe around 3000 BC. A group of pastoralists associated with the Yamnaya culture originally from the grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, had moved west into Central and Northern Europe in a wave that fundamentally altered the genetic composition of the continent. In some regions, the Yamnaya-related ancestry replaced up to 75% of the previous gene pool within just a few centuries. This was not a slow, gradual process of cultural exchange. This was a mass migration that resulted in near-total population replacement in some areas. The implications for Britain were immediately obvious, but it took a few more years for the data to be gathered. In 2018, the landmark study arrived. A paper published in Nature by Inigo Ola, David Reich, and a large international team analyzed the genomes of 400 prehistoric Europeans, including dozens of individuals from Britain. The results, combined with a companion paper, focused specifically on the British Isles, told a story that nobody expected. The Neolithic farming population of Britain, the people who built Stonehenge, the long barrows, Avery, and everything else, was almost entirely replaced around 2400 BC. The replacement was not gradual. Within a few generations, the genetic profile of Britain shifted from predominantly Neolithic farmer ancestry to predominantly bee-associated ancestry. A population with significant Yamna steppe, her parent heritage, mixed with Central European farmer genetics. The numbers were stark. By 2000 BC, the Neolithic farmer contribution to the British gene pool had dropped to less than 10%. In some regions and time periods, it was even lower. The people who had lived in Britain for over 500 years, who had cleared the forests, built the monuments, developed the ceremonial landscape of Sesbury Plain, and dragged the blue stones from Wales were genetically speaking gone. This finding was a bombshell. It challenged decades of archaeological orthodoxy. It reopened questions about migration, violence, and population dynamics that many researchers had thought were settled. And it posed a question that still has no definitive answer. What happened to the Neolithic people of Britain? The people who replaced them are known to archaeology as the Beaker folk or the Bell Beaker culture, named after the distinctive bell-shaped pottery vessels that are found across Western Europe from roughly 2800 to 800 BC. The Beaker phenomenon is one of the most widespread cultural complexes in European prehistory. Beaker-style pottery, along with associated artifacts like copper daggers, stone wrist guards, arrowheads and gold ornaments, is found from Portugal to Poland, from Sicily to Scotland. For a long time, archaeologists debated whether the spread of Beaker culture represented the movement of people or the movement of ideas. Were the Beers a migrating population carrying their pottery and customs with them? Or were they a fashion trend, a set of prestige goods and practices that spread through trade and cultural contact? The DNA evidence has settled this debate, at least for Britain. The Beaker-associated individuals found in British burials are genetically distinct from the preceding Neolithic population. They carry significant steppe ancestry, ultimately derived from the Yamna migration, mixed with Central European farmer ancestry. They did not inherit their genes from the local Neolithic population. They came from the continent. The earliest Beaker burials in Britain date to around 2450 BC. They appear first in southeastern England, suggesting an initial arrival across the Channel. The burials are distinctive. Unlike the communal collective burials of the Neolithic, where bones were mixed and rearranged in shared tombs, the Beaker people buried their dead individually in crouched positions in single graves, often accompanied by a beaker pot, a copper dagger, and sometimes gold jewelry. This is a fundamentally different attitude toward death and the individual. The Neolithic people saw themselves as part of a collective defined by their relationship to the ancestors and the community. The Beaker people saw themselves as individuals buried with their personal possessions, their identity preserved in death. This shift from communal to individual burial is one of the most significant cultural transformations in British prehistory. And it happened in tandem with the genetic replacement. The Beaker people brought new technologies with them. They were among the first metal workers in Britain, bringing knowledge of copper and later bronze smelting. The earliest metal artifacts in Britain, small copper knives and awls, date to around 2400 BC and are found in Beaker contexts. The transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age in Britain was not a local invention. It was imported by newcomers. They also brought different agricultural practices. The Neolithic farmers had relied heavily on cattle and wheat. The Beaker people seem to have placed more emphasis on barley and on pastoral farming, particularly in upland areas. The landscape began to change again, with new patterns of field systems, enclosures, and settlements appearing across Britain. Perhaps most significantly, the Beaker people brought a different language. We cannot know what language the Neolithic farmers of Britain spoke because they left no texts, and their language has no surviving descendants. But linguistic analysis suggests that the Indo-European languages, the family that includes Celtic, Germanic, Latin, Greek, and most of the languages of modern Europe, arrived in Western Europe with the steppe-derived migrations, of which the Beaker people were a part. The languages spoken in Britain before the Beaker arrival are completely lost. There are hints, tantalizing fragments in place, names and river names that resist Indo-European etymology. The river Tempemes, for example, the river Severn, the name Britain itself, may be pre-Celtic, pre-Indo-European, a word from a language that has been dead for over 4,000 years. These ghost words are the last traces of the language spoken by the builders of Stonehenge. So, what happened? How did an entire population, one that had lived in Britain for over 1,500 years and built some of the most impressive monuments in prehistoric Europe, simply disappear from the genetic record? This is the central mystery, and there is no consensus answer. But there are several hypotheses, and each of them tells us something important about how population dynamics work in prehistory. The first and most dramatic hypothesis is violent displacement. The Beaker people arrived, fought the existing population, and killed or drove them out. There is some indirect evidence for this. The late Neolithic in Britain shows signs of social stress. Some causeway enclosures have evidence of violent death, including arrowheads embedded in human bone. The Beaker people were buried with weapons, specifically daggers and arrowheads, which suggests that martial identity was important to them, and the speed of the genetic replacement, essentially complete within a few generations, is consistent with a hostile takeover rather than a slow process of intermarriage. But direct evidence for large-scale violence is thin. There are no battlefields, no mass graves, no burned settlements that can be clearly attributed to Beaker aggression. The archaeological record of the transition is actually remarkably quiet. The Neolithic monuments were not destroyed. They were not defaced or desecrated. In some cases, the Beaker people continued to use them, burying their dead near the entrances of older monuments or adding new features to existing sites. At Stonehenge itself, the avenue was reworked and the blue stones were rearranged during the Beaker period. The newcomers seem to have respected or appropriated the monuments rather than rejecting them. The second hypothesis is disease. The Beaker people came from a continent where populations had been mixing and exchanging pathogens for millennia. The Neolithic farmers of Britain, living on an island with limited contact with the outside world, may have had no immunity to diseases carried by the newcomers. This is the same dynamic that devastated indigenous populations in the Americas after European contact, and it does not require any intentional violence. A population without immunity to a novel pathogen can lose 50 to 90% of its members within a generation. The plague bacterium Yinia pestis has been found in ancient DNA samples from Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe, including some pre-Beaker contexts. If plague or a similar epidemic swept through the Neolithic population of Britain shortly before or during the Beaker arrival, it could have created a demographic vacuum that the newcomers simply filled. A devastated population reduced to a fraction of its former numbers would have been in no position to resist or compete with a healthy growing migrant community. This hypothesis is attractive because it explains the speed and completeness of the replacement without requiring organized violence. But it is speculative. We have no direct evidence of an epidemic in Neolithic Britain during the relevant period. The presence of plague in some European populations does not prove that it reached Britain, and, even if it did, its impact is unknown. The third hypothesis is demographic swamping. The Beaker people may have arrived in sufficient numbers, and with a sufficiently high population growth rate, that they simply outbred the existing population over a few centuries. If the Neolithic population was already declining for other reasons, perhaps poor harvests, soil exhaustion, social disruption, or low fertility, a vigorous incoming population could have dominated through sheer numbers. Each generation, the proportion of Beaker ancestry would have increased, and the proportion of Neolithic ancestry would have decreased, even without any violence at all. This is actually how many population replacements in human history have worked. It is not necessary to kill everyone. You just need to have more children who survive to adulthood. If the incoming group has better nutrition, better immunity to local diseases, better access to resources, or simply a cultural tendency toward larger families, the mathematics of population growth will do the rest. The fourth hypothesis is a combination of all of the above. Disease weakened the Neolithic population. The Beaker people arrived and took advantage of the resulting power vacuum. There was some violence, some intermarriage, some displacement, and some peaceful coexistence, all happening simultaneously in different parts of Britain. Over time, the Beaker-derived population grew, while the Neolithic-derived population shrank, and within a few centuries, the genetic signature of the original builders was almost gone. This last hypothesis is probably closest to the truth because real human events are almost always messier than any single explanation can capture. But the honest answer is that we don't know. We don't know whether the last Neolithic farmers in Britain died of plague, fled to marginal uplands, were absorbed into Beaker communities, or fought losing battles against better armed invaders. The DNA tells us the outcome, but not the process. It tells us that a population was replaced, but not how it happened. And it leaves the biggest question of all completely unanswered. Where did they go? The genetic data shows that the Neolithic farmer ancestry in Britain dropped to less than 10% by around 2000 BC. But that 10% is interesting because it is not zero. Some mixing did occur. Some Neolithic genes survived into the Beaker and Bronze Age populations, and the distribution of that surviving ancestry may hold clues about what happened to the original builders. The remaining Neolithic ancestry appears to be slightly more prevalent in certain regions, particularly in parts of western and northern Britain. Wales, Scotland, and Ireland all show marginally higher levels of pre-B ancestry compared to southeastern England, where the Beaker presence arrived earliest and was strongest. This pattern is consistent with a model where the Neolithic population was pushed to the geographic margins by the advancing Beaker frontier, surviving longest in the uplands and western fringes, where the newcomers were slowest to establish themselves. Ireland presents a particularly interesting case. The Neolithic population of Ireland was like Britain's, largely derived from continental farmers who had arrived around 4000 BC. Ireland's own tradition of megalithic construction is older and in some ways more impressive than Britain's. Newgrange, the passage tomb in the Boone Valley, was built around 3200 BC, centuries before the main phase of Stonehenge. The Carramore complex in County Sigo, maybe even older. Ireland had its own rich Neolithic culture, its own monuments, its own ritual traditions, and Ireland also experienced a Beaker-associated genetic transformation, though the timing and completeness appear to differ slightly from Britain. Beaker-style pottery and metalwork appear in Ireland from around 2500 BC, and the genetic data shows a similar pattern of population turnover, though some studies suggest that the Neolithic farmer contribution to the Irish gene pool may be slightly higher than in Britain, possibly around 15 to 20% in some populations. Did the displaced Neolithic farmers of Britain flee to Ireland? Some of them may have. The sea crossing between Wales and Ireland is short, especially from the Pembrokeshire coast to the southeast corner of Ireland. These were people who had already demonstrated the ability to transport massive stones by water. Crossing the Irish Sea in a hideboat or dugout canoe would have been well within their capabilities. But this is speculation. We don't have a clear genetic trail of Neolithic British farmers arriving in Ireland. The Neolithic populations of Britain and Ireland were already closely related, having both descended from the same wave of continental farmers. Distinguishing a new arrival from an existing resident at the genetic level is extremely difficult when both populations share the same ancestry. Another possibility is that some of the Neolithic population migrated back to continental Europe. The farming communities of Brittany, Normandy, and the Atlantic coast of France were genetically similar to those in Britain. There were long-standing connections across the Channel, maintained by boat travel and exchange networks. When conditions in Britain deteriorated, whether from disease, competition with newcomers, or other pressures, returning to the continent would have been a logical option for communities living along the southern coast. Again, this is speculative. The challenge with tracking ancient migrations is that we need large numbers of well-preserved ancient DNA samples from the right places and the right time periods, and those samples are not always available. The movement of a few hundred or even a few thousand people across the Channel in 2400 BC would be very difficult to detect in the genetic record, especially when the source and destination populations were already closely related. A more disturbing possibility is that the Neolithic population didn't go anywhere. They died, not in battle necessarily, but from the accumulated effects of disease, displacement, loss of territory, and social collapse. If their agricultural system was disrupted, if their ceremonial centers were taken over, if their communities were fragmented and scattered, they may simply have failed to reproduce at replacement levels. Within a few generations, a declining population with no territorial base and no social cohesion would have ceased to exist as a recognizable group. This is what happened to many indigenous populations in the Americas after European contact. The killing was not always done with weapons. It was done with smallpox, measles, influenza, disrupted food systems, broken communities, and the simple grinding mathematics of demographic collapse. A population that loses half its members in a single generation, and then half again in the next, and then half again after that, will be reduced to almost nothing within a century. The honest truth is that we probably will never know with certainty what happened to the people who built Stonehenge. The DNA tells us they were replaced. The archaeology tells us the replacement happened quickly, but the human stories behind those data points, the individual decisions, the individual fates, the moments of resistance and surrender and flight and death, are lost to time. What we can say is this: a civilization that lasted for over 1,000 years, that built monuments which have endured for 5 millennia, that developed a sophisticated understanding of astronomy and engineering, that created one of the most extraordinary ritual landscapes in the history of the world, was erased from the genetic map of Britain in a matter of generations, and the monument they left behind, the one we call Stonehenge, is now associated in the popular imagination with the Celts, a people who had nothing to do with its construction, and who wouldn't arrive in Britain for another 1,000 years. Let's talk about the Celtic myth, because it is one of the most persistent and damaging misconceptions in British history. The idea that the Celts built Stonehenge goes back to the 17th century, when the antiquarian John Aubrey, the same man who discovered the Aubrey holes, suggested that Stonehenge was built by the Druids, the priestly class of the Celtic peoples, described by Roman writers like Julius Caesar and Pliny the Elder. Aubrey's suggestion was picked up and amplified by William Slee in the 18th century, who conducted the first serious surveys of Stonehenge and Avery, but also developed an elaborate theory about the Druids that owed more to his own romantic imagination than to any evidence. Stuckel's Druid-Stonehenge connection was wildly popular. It caught the public imagination and never really let go. By the 19th century, the association was so firmly established that Druids were being depicted at Stonehenge in paintings, poems, and popular histories as if it were established fact. Modern Druid groups, many of which trace their origins to 18th century revival movements rather than to any genuine ancient tradition, adopted Stonehenge as their spiritual home. The annual summer solstice gathering at Stonehenge, which draws thousands of people every year, is largely a product of this modern Druidic tradition. The problem is that none of this has any basis in archaeology. The Celts are a linguistic and cultural group, not a genetic one. Celtic languages, a branch of the Indo-European language family, include Welsh, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Breton, Cornish, and the extinct Guish and Celtarian. The earliest evidence of Celtic languages in Britain comes from the Iron Age, roughly 750 BC at the earliest, though some scholars push the date later. The people who spoke Celtic languages in Iron Age Britain were the descendants of the Beaker people and subsequent Bronze Age populations, not the Neolithic farmers who built Stonehenge. The Druids, as described by Roman sources, were a priestly class within Celtic society. They are described as judges, teachers, and religious authorities who presided over sacrifices, maintained oral traditions, and spent years memorizing sacred knowledge. Whether the Roman descriptions are accurate is debatable, since the Romans had every reason to portray the peoples they were conquering in ways that justified conquest. But even if we take the Roman accounts at face value, the Druids were an Iron Age institution. They existed in the last few centuries BC and the 1st century AD. Stonehenge had been standing for over 2,000 years by that point. Did Iron Age Celts visit Stonehenge? Almost certainly. Did they consider it a sacred place? Quite possibly. There is some evidence of Iron Age activity at the site, though it is sparse. But visiting a monument and building it are two very different things. Modern tourists visit the Colosseum in Rome without being ancient Romans. Medieval Christians worshipped in converted Roman temples without being the people who built them. The Celts at Stonehenge were inheritors of a monument they did not create, visitors to a place whose original meaning was already lost. The persistence of the Celtic Druid Stonehenge myth is partly a function of cultural nationalism. The Celts have been adopted as the ancestral culture of Britain and Ireland, the indigenous people of these islands before the Romans and Saxons arrived. Connecting them to Stonehenge gives them a deeper history, a more impressive origin story. It makes the Celts seem ancient, established, and monumental. But it also erases the people who actually built the thing. The Neolithic farmers of Britain, the people who quarried the blue stones in Wales, who dragged the sass from the Marlborough Downs, who dug the ditches at Avery and built Silbury Hill, who cremated their dead and buried them in the Aubrey holes, have no modern descendant culture to claim them. They left no written records, no surviving language, no continuous cultural tradition. They are anonymous, voiceless, and largely forgotten. The Celts get the credit for their work, and nobody corrects the error, because the real builders have no advocates. This is slowly changing. The DNA revolution has given the Neolithic farmers a kind of genetic identity, a population signature that can be tracked and studied. Archaeologists are increasingly emphasizing the Neolithic origins of Britain's great monuments and pushing back against the casual conflation of Celtic and prehistoric. But in the popular imagination, the Druids at Stonehenge remain a powerful image, and myths that are 500 years old are hard to dislodge. The blue stones remain one of the deepest mysteries of Stonehenge, and recent research has made them more mysterious, not less. As we discussed earlier, the blue stones were quarried in the Presley Hills of southwest Wales, over 150 miles from Stonehenge. The two main quarry sites, KHN God and Craig Rossi Felon, have been excavated in detail by a team led by Mike Parker Pearson and geologist Rob Iyer. The evidence for human quarrying is clear. Stone platforms, wedge marks, and loading bays show that pillars of dolerite and rhyolite were systematically extracted from natural outcrops and prepared for transport. But the radiocarbon dates from the quarries have produced a surprise. Some of the quarrying activity dates to around 3400 BC, roughly 500 years before the blue stones were erected at Stonehenge. There is a gap of several centuries between the extraction of the stones and their arrival on Salisbury Plain. Where were the blue stones during those missing centuries? Parker Pearson has proposed a bold hypothesis. He believes there was an original blue stone circle in Wales erected near the quarry sites that was later dismantled and transported to Stonehenge. In 2021, his team announced the discovery of what may be that original circle at a site called Warm Morn on the slopes of the Presley Hills. They found a series of stone holes arranged in a circle, roughly 110 meters in diameter, the same diameter as the ditch at Stonehenge. The holes matched the sizes and shapes of some of the blue stones, now at Stonehenge. One of the holes still contained a stone stump that was a geological match for a blue stone at the Ayers, Wiltshire site. If Parker Pearson is correct, then Stonehenge was not built from scratch on Salisbury Plain. Part of it was an existing monument transported whole from Wales, dismantled stone by stone, and re-erected in a new location over 150 miles away. The blue stones were not just raw material. They were sacred objects with their own history, their own meaning, their own power. This raises fascinating questions about the relationship between Wales and Wiltshire in the Neolithic period. We already know that some of the people buried at Stonehenge in its earliest phase may have spent their childhood in Wales based on the strontium isotope analysis. If an entire stone circle was moved from Wales to Wiltshire, it suggests a deep and sustained connection between the two regions, possibly involving migration, alliance, or unification of separate communities. Were the people of Preseli and the people of Salisbury Plain the same community, separated by distance, but united by a shared identity and a shared sacred landscape? Did the dismantling of the Welsh circle and its transport to Wiltshire represent the merging of two communities, the centralizing of religious authority, or the relocation of a defeated population bringing their sacred objects with them? We simply don't know. But the blue stone mystery is no longer just about how the stones were moved. It is about why they were moved, what they meant to the people who moved them, and what the act of moving them tells us about the social and political dynamics of Neolithic Britain. To understand the disappearance of the Neolithic people of Britain, you have to zoom out and look at what was happening across Europe in the 3rd millennium B.C., because Britain was not unique. The same pattern of population replacement played out across the continent from the Iberian Peninsula to Scandinavia, driven by the same steppe-derived migration that eventually sent the Beaker people to British shores. The story begins on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching from modern Ukraine to Kazakhstan. Around 3300 BC, a pastoral culture known as the Yamna emerged here. The Yamna were cattle herders and horse riders. They lived in small mobile groups following their herds across the open steppe. They buried their dead in individual graves under earth mounds called kirians. They were among the first people to make extensive use of wheeled carts and horse-drawn vehicles, technologies that gave them an extraordinary ability to move across the landscape, and move they did. Starting around 3000 BC, Yamna-related populations began expanding westward into Europe. The scale and speed of this expansion was remarkable. Within a few centuries, steppe-derived ancestry appeared in populations across Central and Northern Europe, from Germany to the Baltic, from Scandinavia to the British Isles. In some regions, the existing populations were almost completely replaced. In others, there was more mixing. But everywhere the Yamna went, they left a massive genetic footprint. The vehicle for this expansion into Western Europe was the Beaker culture. Though the relationship between the Amna and the Beaker people is not straightforward, the earliest Belbeek appear in Iberia around 200–800 BC, in a population with no steppe ancestry. At all, the Beaker package of artifacts, the distinctive bell-shaped pots, the archery sets, the metalwork seems to have originated in southwestern Europe among the existing farming populations. But as the Beaker phenomenon spread northward and eastward, it was adopted by populations that did carry steppe ancestry. By the time it reached the Netherlands and the lower Rhine Valley, the people making and using Beaker pottery were a genetically mixed population with significant Yamna-derived heritage. It was these northern steppe-influence Beaker groups that crossed the Channel to Britain around 2450 BC. So the Beaker culture was not a single unified people. It was a cultural package that spread through both migration and cultural diffusion, adopted by genetically different populations in different regions. The Beakers in Iberia were genetically different from the Beakers in the Netherlands, who were genetically different from the Beakers in Britain. What they shared was a set of material culture traits, a technology, a lifestyle, a set of burial practices, and probably a social ideology centered on individual achievement and martial prowess. The steppe migration that ultimately drove the Beaker expansion into Britain was one of the most transformative events in European prehistory. It reshaped the genetic map of the continent. It brought the Indo-European languages, the ancestor of almost all modern European languages, from the steppe into Western Europe. It replaced the Neolithic farming cultures that had built the megaliths, the passage tombs, the stone circles, and the hennes that still dot the Atlantic coastline. Everywhere the steppe-derived populations went, the old Neolithic cultures faded. In Scandinavia, the funnel beaker culture was replaced by the corded ware culture, which carries heavy steppe ancestry. In Central Europe, the late Neolithic cultures were similarly transformed. In Iberia, the arrival of steppe ancestry came later, around 2000 BC, but when it came, it resulted in a dramatic shift, with Neolithic farmer ancestry declining sharply in the male line while persisting more strongly in the female line, suggesting male-biased migration. Britain was part of this continental pattern, not an exception to it. The disappearance of the Neolithic farmers of Britain was not a uniquely British tragedy. It was one chapter in a continental-scale population transformation that remade Europe between 3000 and 2000 BC. The people who built Stonehenge, Newgrange, Karnak, the Almendres Cromk in Portugal, and countless other megalithic monuments across Atlantic Europe all shared a similar fate. They were replaced, absorbed, or marginalized by incoming populations from the East, and the world they had built became the inheritance of people who had no part in its creation. This continental perspective matters because it changes how we think about the Stonehenge builders' disappearance. If they were simply defeated by a more aggressive local rival, that would be one kind of story. But they were swept away by a demographic tsunami that was reshaping the entire continent. They were not uniquely unlucky. They were caught in the same current that drowned Neolithic cultures from Portugal to Poland. And yet, their monuments survived. Stonehenge stood. Newgrange stood. The Callanish stones stood. The stone circles and long barrows and passage tombs endured while the people who built them were forgotten. The stones became part of new cultures, reinterpreted by new peoples who invented their own stories to explain them. The Celts attributed them to giants and gods. Medieval Christians thought they were the work of the devil. Early antiquarians credited them to the Romans or the Phoenicians. It was not until the 20th century that archaeology began to piece together the true story, and not until the 21st century that DNA gave that story its full, unsettling dimension. The landscape around Stonehenge continues to produce discoveries that challenge our understanding of the monument and the people who built it. In 2020, a team of archaeologists using remote sensing technology announced the discovery of a massive circle of deep shafts arranged around Durrington walls. The shafts, each roughly 5 meters in diameter and 5 meters deep, were found using ground-penetrating radar and bore holes. There were at least 20 of them, arranged in a circle over 2 kilometers in diameter, centered roughly on Durrington walls. The circle is the largest prehistoric structure ever found in Britain. The shafts are not natural. They are too regular in size, too evenly spaced, and too precisely arranged to be geological features. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the fill of some shafts has returned dates consistent with the late Neolithic, around the time that Stonehenge and Durrington walls were in active use. What were they for? Nobody knows for certain. One theory is that they were boundary markers defining the edge of a sacred precinct around Durrington walls. Another is that they were part of a counting system related to the astronomical functions of the Stonehenge complex. A third possibility is that they were connected to water management, since the chalk aquifer in the area would have filled the shafts with water at certain times of the year, creating a circle of pools that reflected the sky. Whatever their purpose, the shaft circle demonstrates that the ceremonial landscape around Stonehenge, was even more extensive and more carefully planned than we previously realized. These were not people building monuments in isolation. They were reshaping an entire landscape according to a coherent plan, coordinating construction projects that spanned miles and decades. In 2023, further analysis of the Stonehenge landscape revealed the remains of a previously unknown large timber structure near the western end of the Curses. The structure, detected through magnetometry and confirmed by targeted excavation, appears to have been a substantial timber buildings or enclosure dating to the mid-3rd millennium BC. Its relationship to the stone circle and other monuments in the area is still being studied, but its presence adds another layer to an already complex picture. The Sarsen stone provenance study published in 2020 also yielded important results by analyzing the chemical composition of a core drilled from stone 58 during restoration work in 1958 and comparing it to Sarsen boulders across southern England. The research team was able to pinpoint the source of most of the Stonehenge Sassins to a specific location at Westwoods near the village of Lockage in Wiltshire, about 25 kilometers north of Stonehenge. This was a more precise sourcing than had previously been possible, and it confirmed that the Sarsen transport route ran south across the Marlborough Downs and down onto Spurry Plain. Interestingly, one of the Sassin stones, the so-called altar stone, which lies flat in the center of the monument, turned out not to be a Sassin at all. Recent geological analysis published in 2024 identified the altar stone as a type of old red sandstone, and surprisingly, it does not come from Wales as previously assumed. The geochemical signature points to a source in northeast Scotland, possibly the Orcadian Basin, over 700 kilometers from Stonehenge. If this identification is correct, it represents the longest distance any stone was transported to Stonehenge and raises entirely new questions about the geographic reach of the monument's builders and the extent of their exchange networks. A stone from Scotland at the heart of Stonehenge would mean that the monument's builders had connections, or at least contacts that stretched the entire length of Britain. It would link Stonehenge to the rich Neolithic culture of Orkney, where Skara, the Ring of Brodgar, and Maeshowe represent some of the most sophisticated Neolithic architecture in the world. Were these far-flung communities connected by trade, by religion, by kinship, or by some kind of political alliance? The idea of a Neolithic nation stretching from Orkney to Wiltshire seems far-fetched, but the stones are stubbornly physical evidence that something was connecting these distant places. Geophysical surveys of the area around Stonehenge have also revealed hundreds of previously unknown features buried beneath the surface. Ditches, pits, post holes, and possible building foundations carpet the landscape for miles around the stone circle. Many of these features have never been excavated, and their dates and functions are unknown. The Stonehenge landscape is not fully explored. It is not even close to being fully explored. There may be decades of discoveries still waiting in the chalk beneath Spurry Plain. Modern technology has also revolutionized our understanding of the people themselves, not just their monuments. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones can reveal where an individual grew up, what they ate, and how their diet changed over their lifetime. Strontium isotopes, which vary according to local geology, act as a kind of geographic fingerprint, showing where a person lived during childhood when their teeth were forming. Oxygen isotopes can indicate the temperature and rainfall of the area where they lived. Nitrogen and carbon isotopes reveal the balance of meat, fish, cereals, and dairy in their diet. These analyses have been applied to hundreds of Neolithic and Bronze Age individuals from across Britain, and the results paint a picture of a surprisingly mobile population. People moved, they traveled between regions, married into distant communities, and maintained connections across hundreds of miles. The builders of Stonehenge were not isolated peasants scratching a living from the local soil. They were part of a dynamic, interconnected world. One particularly striking example is the Amesbury Archer, discovered in 2002 in a grave about 3 miles from Stonehenge. The burial dates to around 2300 BC, right at the transition between the Neolithic and the Beaker period. The man was buried with the richest collection of grave goods found in any British Bronze Age burial, including 5 beaker pots, 3 copper knives, 2 gold hair ornaments, a stone wrist guard, and a collection of flint tools. Oxygen isotope analysis of his teeth showed that he grew up in the Alpine region of Central Europe, probably in what is now Switzerland, southern Germany, or Austria. This man traveled over 1,000 miles from his childhood home to Wiltshire, where he was buried within sight of Stonehenge, with more wealth than any other known individual of his era. Who was he? A trader, a metalworker, a chief, a priest? We don't know. But his presence near Stonehenge at the very moment of transition between the Neolithic and the Beaker period is tantalizing. He may have been among the first wave of Beaker migrants, one of the people who would eventually replace the monument's original builders. Another individual known as the Bosom Bowman was found in a collective grave near Stonehenge, dating to roughly the same period. Isotope analysis showed that at least one of the individuals had grown up in Wales. This adds to the evidence for a continuing connection between Stonehenge and Wales, even as the population was changing. DNA analysis of Neolithic burials across Britain has revealed something else about the social structure of these communities. Many of the collective tombs, the long barrows and passage graves where dozens of individuals were buried over centuries, contain people who were biologically related. Extended families used the same tomb for generations, adding new members and revisiting the bones of their ancestors. Patrilineal descent, tracing lineage through the male line, seems to have been important, though maternal connections were also maintained. At Hazelton North Longbarrow, in Gloucestershire, a 2021 study reconstructed the family tree of 35 individuals buried in the tomb over a period of about 100 years, from roughly 3,700 to 3,600 BC. The results showed a multi-generational patrilineal lineage, with men buried in the same tomb as were their fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers. Women married into the family from elsewhere, reflecting a pattern of patrilineal residence, where men stayed in their natal community while women moved to their husbands' community at marriage. This is the closest we have come to seeing the actual social structure of the people who built the earliest British monuments. These were patrilineal farming families, embedded in multi-generational lineages bound to specific places by the presence of their ancestors' bones. The long barrows were family tombs, ancestral shrines, and title deeds to the landscape all at once. To be buried in the barrow was to belong permanently and irrevocably to that place and that lineage. When the Beaker people arrived and replaced these communities, they were not just displacing individuals, they were breaking lineages that stretched back centuries. They were severing the connection between the living and the dead. That was the foundation of Neolithic social identity. The long barrows were sealed. The cremation deposits at Stonehenge stopped. The cycle of ancestor worship that had sustained these communities for over 1,000 years was ended. There is something deeply unsettling about the Stonehenge story, something that goes beyond the usual archaeological puzzle of who built this and why. It is the silence. The Neolithic farmers of Britain spent over 5,500 years on the island. They transformed the landscape from dense forest to open farmland. They built monuments that have lasted 5,000 years. They developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, engineering capabilities, and long-distance trade networks that spanned the entire length of Britain and reached across the Channel to continental Europe. They cremated their dead with care and buried them in sacred places. They quarried stones in Wales and dragged them 150 miles to Salisbury Plain. And they left no voice behind, no writing, no inscriptions, no carved images that we can confidently interpret, no mythology that survived to be recorded by later peoples. The Celts, who arrived over 1,000 years later, had rich oral traditions that were eventually written down by medieval monks. The Anglo-Saxons had Beowulf. The Norse had the sagas. But the Neolithic people of Britain have nothing. Their language is extinct, unknown, unrecoverable. Their beliefs can only be inferred from the orientation of their monuments and the arrangement of their dead. Their stories are gone. This is what makes the DNA evidence so poignant. It is not just that a population was replaced. It is that a culture was erased so completely that until the 21st century, we didn't even know they existed as a distinct people. For 300 years, the credit for their greatest achievement was given to the Druids, to the Celts, to people who arrived on the scene millennia too late. The actual builders were invisible, nameless, forgotten. The monuments were all that survived, and the monuments stripped of their original meaning by the passage of time and the disappearance of their creators became blank canvases onto which successive cultures projected their own stories. The Romans saw barbarian temples. The medieval English saw the work of Merlin, the wizard. The 18th century Romantics saw druidic cathedrals. The 20th century hippies saw an astronomical computer. Each generation sees what it wants to see, and none of them sees the people who actually built the thing. This pattern is not unique to Stonehenge. It happens everywhere in the world where ancient monuments survive the civilizations that built them. The pyramids of Egypt were ancient to the ancient Greeks. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe were attributed to Phoenicians and Arabs by European colonizers who couldn't accept that Africans had built them. Nan Madol in Micronesia, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the Nazcalens in Peru. Wherever impressive monuments exist without a clear cultural descendant to claim them, myths rush in to fill the void. But Stonehenge is unusual in one respect. In most cases, we eventually discovered who the builders were and gave them credit. The builders of the pyramids are well known. The builders of Great Zimbabwe have been identified. Göbekliy's creators are being studied. But the builders of Stonehenge still have no name, no identity, no cultural label. They are the Neolithic farmers, or the early agriculturalists, or the pre-Beaker population. They are defined by what they did, when they lived, and how they disappeared, not by who they were. Maybe that is appropriate. They lived in a culture that valued the collective over the individual, the ancestors over the living, the community over the person. Their tombs were communal. Their monuments were the work of hundreds of people over generations. No single name is carved on any stone at Stonehenge, and no individual burial can be identified as the founder or architect. The monument belongs to all of them and to none of them. It is collective memory made physical, the accumulated effort of a civilization, expressed in stone, and then that civilization ended, and the memory was lost, and the stones stood alone. The area around Stonehenge has been heavily managed for over a century, and the management has not always been gentle. In the early 20th century, several of the sarsen stones were straightened, reset in concrete, and stabilized to prevent further collapse. The heelstone was propped up, the lintels were secured, the ground around the monument was landscaped, the grass mowed, and the cattle kept out. The Stonehenge we see today is a partly restored version of the monument, not quite what the original builders left behind, and not quite a natural ruin. The visitor experience has also changed dramatically. Until the 1970s, visitors could walk freely among the stones, touch them, even climb on them. Graffiti from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries is carved into the surface of several stones. Victorian tourists chipped off pieces as souvenirs. In 1900, one of the Sassen uprights fell, and the event prompted the first serious restoration work. Today, visitors are kept at a distance by a rope barrier, and access to the stones is restricted to special sunrise and sunset tours and to private bookings arranged through English Heritage. The A303, one of the major roads connecting London to the southwest, runs within a few hundred meters of the monument, and the question of what to do about the road has been debated for decades. A tunnel has been proposed, opposed, approved, opposed again, and is currently under construction, though its route and design remain controversial. The UNESCO World Heritage Site designation, granted in 1986, covers not just the stone circle, but large area of the surrounding landscape, including Durrington Walls, Woodhenge, the Cursus, the Avenue, hundreds of barrows, and the recently discovered Shaft Circle. Managing this landscape involves balancing the needs of conservation, agriculture, military training on the northern parts of Sudbury Plain, and the roughly 1.5 million visitors who come to Stonehenge every year. Despite all this activity, huge areas of the Stonehenge landscape remain unexcavated. Geophysical surveys have revealed hundreds of anomalies that have never been investigated. New technologies, including LiDAR, drone-mounted sensors, and improved ground-penetrating radar, are constantly adding to our picture of what lies beneath the surface. The Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project, which ran from 2010 to 2014, mapped the area in unprecedented detail and identified numerous previously unknown features, including buried hens, long barrows, and pits. What else is out there waiting to be found? Probably quite a lot. The landscape around Stonehenge has been the focus of archaeological attention for centuries, but the actual area that has been properly excavated is a tiny fraction of the whole. Every year brings new surveys, new discoveries, and new revisions to our understanding of the site. The story of Stonehenge is not finished. It is being rewritten in real time. Let's take stock of what we know and what we don't. We know that Stonehenge was built by Neolithic farmers who arrived in Britain around 4000 BC from the continent, probably from northern France and Iberia. These people were genetically distinct from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers they replaced, and they brought agriculture, domesticated animals, pottery, and a tradition of monument building with them. We know that the earliest phase of Stonehenge around 3000 BC was a cremation cemetery, marked by a circular ditch and the Aubrey holes. Some of the people buried there may have come from Wales, establishing a connection between Stonehenge and the Preseli Hills that predates the arrival of the blue stones. We know that the blue stones were quarried in the Preseli Hills around 3000 BC or earlier, and that they may have been part of a stone circle in Wales before being dismantled and transported to Salisbury Plain. The reasons for this extraordinary act of stone relocation are unknown. We know that the sarsen stones were erected around 2500 BC, brought from the Malra Downs, about 25 to the north. The engineering was sophisticated, involving mortise and tenon and tongue and groove joinery, borrowed from timber construction. The monument was aligned with the solstices, particularly the midwinter sunset. We know that at Durrington Walls, 2 miles northeast of Stonehenge, was a seasonal gathering place where people from across the region came to feast, probably around the winter solstice. The relationship between Durrington Walls and Stonehenge appears to have been complementary, one for the living and one for the dead. We know that around 2400 BC, a new population arrived in Britain from continental Europe. These Beaker people carried steppe-derived ancestry, ultimately traceable to the Yamna, migration from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Within a few generations, the Neolithic farmer population of Britain was almost entirely replaced. The Beaker people brought metalworking, individual burial practices, Indo-European languages, and a different relationship to death and identity. We know that the Neolithic farmer contribution to the modern British gene pool is very small, typically less than 10%, and that this replacement happened across the continent, not just in Britain. The megalithic cultures of Atlantic Europe were largely swept away by the same demographic forces, and we know that the Celts, who are popularly associated with Stonehenge, and the Druids, arrived in Britain roughly 1,000 years after the Neolithic builders had disappeared. They had nothing to do with the construction of the monument. Now, here is what we don't know. We don't know what happened to the Neolithic builders. Were they killed? Did they die of disease? Did they flee to the margins? Did they slowly lose their identity through intermarriage and cultural assimilation? The DNA tells us they were replaced, but not how. The gap between what and how is enormous, and we may never fill it. We don't know what language they spoke. It was not Celtic, not Indo-European, and it left no written traces. A few river names and place names may preserve fragments, but we cannot reconstruct their language from these scraps. We don't know what Stonehenge meant to them. We know it was aligned with the solstices. We know it was associated with the dead. We know it was a place of gathering and ceremony. But the specific beliefs, the stories, the rituals, the reasons why they dragged stones 150 miles across the country and lifted them into the sky, all of that is lost. We are reading a book from which every page has been torn out except the cover and a few scattered. illustrations. We don't know why the blue stones were sacred. Was it the rock itself, the place it came from, the ancestors associated with it, the color, the sound it makes when struck, because some blue stones ring like bells? The answer is probably some combination of all of these, but we cannot know for certain. We don't know whether there are undiscovered monuments, structures, or deposits in the Stonehenge landscape that could change our understanding of the site. The shaft circle around Durrington walls was only discovered in 2020. The altar stone's Scottish origin was only confirmed in 2024. Who knows what will be found in the next decade, and we don't know whether the story of Stonehenge's builders has any relevance to the modern world beyond the purely academic. But I think it does. Here is why. The builders of Stonehenge created something that outlasted them by millennia. They poured their labor, their skill, their beliefs, and their identity into a structure that still stands today, 5,000 years later. They could not have imagined the world we live in. They could not have known that their monument would become one of the most famous structures on Earth. They could not have known that millions of people would travel from every corner of the globe to stand and stare at what they built. But they also could not have known that their own existence would be forgotten, that their language would die, that their genes would be diluted almost to nothing, that the credit for their greatest achievement would be given to people who had nothing to do with it. They could not have known that they would become invisible. And yet, here we are talking about them. Here we are 5,000 years later, using technology they could not have imagined to read their DNA, map their monuments, trace their origins, and piece together the outlines of their lives. They are coming back into focus slowly, fragmentarily through the patient work of archaeologists, geneticists, geologists, and historians. We still don't know their names. We still don't know their language. We still can't hear their voices or read their stories. But we know they existed. We know they were remarkable. We know they built something extraordinary. And we know that they disappeared suddenly and almost completely in a way that reminds us how fragile even the most impressive civilizations can be. The stones endure. The people are gone. And the gap between those two facts, the permanence of the monument and the transience of its makers, is the real mystery of Stonehenge. It is not a mystery about how the stones were moved. It is not a mystery about astronomical alignments or ritual practices. It is a mystery about memory itself, about what survives and what is lost, about who gets remembered and who is forgotten, about the relationship between the things we build and the stories we tell about ourselves. Stonehenge is the oldest unanswered question in Britain, and after 5,000 years, the stones still aren't talking. If this story changed how you think about Stonehenge, or about what happens when civilizations vanish, consider subscribing. We go deep into the histories that nobody else covers, the ones that make you rethink everything you thought you knew. Hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. But before we go, there are some threads in this story that deserve more attention. Questions that keep nagging at the edges of the narrative. Details that complicate the picture in ways that we should not ignore. The first is the question of Orkney. We mentioned earlier that the altar stone at the center of Stonehenge may have come from northeast Scotland, possibly the Orcadian Basin. If that is true, and the geochemical evidence published in 2024 is persuasive, then Stonehenge was not just a regional monument, it was a national one, drawing materials from the entire length of the British Isles. In the Neolithic period was not a remote backwater. It was a cultural powerhouse. The small group of islands off the northern tip of Scotland produced some of the most sophisticated architecture, pottery, and ritual monuments anywhere in Neolithic Europe. Scarabra, the famous Neolithic village on the Bay of Scale, was occupied from around 3180 to 2500 BC. Its stone houses, preserved under sand dunes for 4,000 years, are the best surviving examples of Neolithic domestic architecture in Europe. Each house has a central hearth, stone beds, stone dresses, and even stone drains. The village was a compact, connected settlement, where families lived in close proximity, sharing walls and passageways. It is remarkably sophisticated for a community of a few dozen people on a windswept island in the North Atlantic. The Ring of Brodgar, a massive stone circle on the isthmus between two locks on the Orne mainland, is one of the largest and most impressive stone circles in Britain. It originally contained about 60 stones in a circle over 100 meters in diameter, surrounded by a rock-cut ditch up to 3 meters deep. The effort of carving that ditch from solid bedrock with antler picks and stone tools is almost unimaginable. My show, the Great Chambered Ken, near the Ring of Brodgar, is aligned with the mid-inter sunset, just like the main axis of Stonehenge. On the days around the winter solstice, the setting sun shines down the entrance passage and illuminates the back wall of the central chamber. The interior stonework is so finely dressed and so precisely fitted that you cannot insert a knife blade between the joints. It is by any measure one of the masterpieces of Neolithic architecture. And then there is the Ness of Brodgar, arguably the most important Neolithic site discovered in Britain in the last 20 years. Excavated since 2003, the Ness is a monumental complex of stone buildings on the narrow strip of land between the Ring of Brodgar and the Stones of Stennis. The largest building, Structure 10, is over 25 meters long and 10 meters wide, with walls 5 meters thick. It is not a house. It is a temple, a palace, a gathering hall, or something for which we have no modern equivalent. The interior was decorated with painted plaster, a technique not previously known in Neolithic Britain. The pottery is grooved ware, the same style found at Durrington Walls and other late Neolithic ceremonial sites across Britain. Here is the intriguing part. Grooved ware pottery appears to have originated in Orkney and then spread southward through Scotland and eventually to England. If that is correct, then the cultural influence in the late Neolithic was flowing from north to south, from Orkney to Wiltshire, not the other way around. The architectural and ritual innovations that culminated in Stonehenge may have had their roots in Orkney, carried south by travelers, pilgrims, or migrating communities over the course of centuries. An altar stone from Scotland at the heart of Stonehenge would be consistent with this picture. It would mean that the builders of Stonehenge deliberately incorporated material from the northern cultural homeland of their tradition, just as they incorporated blue stones from Wales. The monument was not a local affair. It was a statement of connection, a physical embodiment of a network that spanned the entire island. The Nest of Brodgar was dramatically abandoned around 2300 BC. The final act at the site was the slaughter of around 600 cattle, the remains of which were deposited in and around the buildings before the entire complex was deliberately buried under a thick layer of rubble and earth. 600 cattle represents an enormous herd. The combined wealth of multiple communities, the mass slaughter and deliberate burial of the nest looks like a ritual termination, a deliberate ending of something that had been central to Arcadian life for centuries. The timing is significant. 2300 BC is right at the transition between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, right when the Beaker people were arriving in Britain. The closure of the Ness of Brodgar may be connected to the same cultural upheaval that was transforming the rest of the island. The old sacred centers were being abandoned. The old rituals ended. The old world closed down. The second thread worth pulling is the engineering. We have discussed the logistics of moving and erecting the stones, but we have not fully appreciated just how knowledgeable the Stonehenge builders were. These were not people applying brute force and hoping for the best. They were systematic thinkers who understood materials, forces, and geometry. Consider the problem of leveling the lintels. The ground at Stonehenge slopes gently from southwest to northeast. If you simply erected uprights of the same height and placed lintels on top, the lintels would follow the slope of the ground and the top of the monument would be tilted. The builders compensated for this by making the southwestern uprights shorter and the northeastern uprights taller, so that the tops of all the uprights, and therefore all the lintels, were at the same level, despite the sloping ground. This means they surveyed the site before construction, calculated the degree of slope, determined how much height compensation was needed at each position around the circle, and then shaped each upright to the correct height. They did all of this without measuring instruments, without levels or theodolites, using nothing more than ropes, stakes, and their own eyes. The accuracy they achieved is within a few centimeters across the entire circle. The shaping of the stones also reveals careful thought. The sarsen uprights are not uniform cylinders. They taper slightly toward the top, creating an illusion called entasis that makes them appear straight when viewed from below. This is the same optical illusion used in the columns of the Parthenon in Athens, though Stonehenge predates the Parthenon by 2,000 years. Whether the entasis was deliberately designed for aesthetic purposes or was simply a practical consequence of reducing weight at the top is debated, but either way, it shows an awareness of how stone behaves visually in 3 dimensions. The lintels were curved on their inner and outer faces to match the curve of the circle. This meant that each lintel had to be shaped individually, with the curvature calculated based on the radius of the circle at that point. The tongue and groove joints that connected adjacent lintels were positioned off-center, probably to prevent the lintels from sliding outward under their own weight. All of this was done with stone tools. Every surface was shaped by pounding with sarsen moles, hammerstones weighing between 2 and 60 pounds that were smashed against the surface to grind it smooth. Experimental archaeologists have estimated that dressing a single sarsen upright to the level of finish seen at Stonehenge would have taken a team of workers several months of continuous effort. The knowledge to do all of this did not appear from nowhere. It was the product of a tradition of megalithic construction that had been developing for 1,000 years across the British Isles and Atlantic Europe. The builders of Stonehenge were drawing on centuries of accumulated experience with stone, timber, earth, and the forces of nature. They were not inventing from scratch. They were perfecting a craft. The third thread is the question of hierarchy and power. Who organized the construction of Stonehenge? Who decided where the stones would go, how they would be shaped, and what the monument would look like? Who commanded the labor of hundreds or thousands of workers over years or decades? The standard answer is that Neolithic society was organized along kinship lines with authority vested in lineage elders or ritual specialists, rather than in individual rulers or kings. This is consistent with the communal burial practices, the absence of obviously wealthy individual graves, and the general egalitarian tone of early Neolithic culture. But by the time the sarsen phase of Stonehenge was constructed around 2500 BC, something had changed. The scale of the project required a level of coordination that goes beyond what a loose network of farming families could achieve. Somebody had to plan the layout, organize the quarrying and transport, manage the labor force, feed the workers, and ensure quality control. This implies a level of centralized authority that does not easily fit the egalitarian model. Some researchers have proposed that late Neolithic Britain was moving toward a more hierarchical social structure, with emerging leaders who accumulated power through their ability to organize large-scale collective projects. Building Stonehenge was in this view simultaneously a religious act and a political one. The ability to mobilize labor, command resources, and complete a project of this scale would have conferred enormous prestige on the individual or lineage that led it. There is some indirect evidence for this. The distribution of high-value artifacts like polished stone axes from distant sources shows that some individuals and communities had more extensive exchange networks than others. The placement of certain burials in prominent positions at ceremonial sites suggests differential status, and the sheer concentration of monumental construction in the Stonehenge Avery area, compared to the rest of Britain, implies that this region was politically or ceremonially dominant, but we have no clear evidence of a ruler, a chief, or a king in Neolithic Britain. No palace, no throne, no royal burial with heaped-up treasures. The power structure of the people who built Stonehenge remains as mysterious as the people themselves. When the Beaker people arrived, they brought a very different model of social organization. Individual burials with personal weapons and wealth, prestige goods that marked out individual status, the beginnings of a warrior elite culture that would characterize the Bronze Age. The transition from Neolithic collective identity to Beaker individual identity was not just a change in burial practices, it was a revolution in how people understood power status and the relationship between the individual, and the group. The final thread is simply the weight of what was lost. We have been talking about populations, percentages, genetic signatures, and archaeological phases. But behind those abstractions were real people, families who had farmed the same land for generations, children who played in the shadow of the stones, elders who remembered the stories of the ancestors, communities that gathered at Dorrington walls every winter to feast, to celebrate, to give thanks, and to honor the dead. Those people had names, they had faces, they had voices, they loved their children and mourned their dead. They told stories around the fire at night, stories about the world, about the gods, about the ancestors who built the great monuments. They sang songs, they laughed, they argued, they hoped for a good harvest and feared a bad winter. And all of it, every word, every song, every story, every name, is gone. Utterly, irrecoverably gone. What survives is stone, the most permanent material they worked with, the medium they chose for their most important creation, is the only thing that outlasted them. Everything else, the wood, the leather, the bone, the words, the beliefs, the relationships, the meaning, all of it has dissolved into the chalk of Salisbury Plain. The Neolithic builders of Stonehenge lived and died and were forgotten, and their monument was claimed by strangers. It is in its way one of the saddest stories in British history, not because of any single dramatic event, no burning of Rome, no fall of Jerusalem, but because of the completeness of the forgetting. An entire civilization, with all its knowledge, all its art, all its love and labor, reduced to a circle of stones on a windy plain, and a few fragments of bone in the earth beneath. We are only now, 5,000 years later, beginning to remember them. And the stones, silent as always, are not helping. There is one more thing worth saying before we close. Something about perspective. Every generation that has encountered Stonehenge has projected its own concerns onto the stone monument. The medieval English, living in a world shaped by Christianity, saw it as the work of supernatural forces, either divine or demonic. The Renaissance antiquarians, fascinated by the classical world, tried to attribute it to the Romans or the Phoenicians. The Romantic movement, yearning for a pre-industrial spiritual authenticity, invented the Druid connection. The 20th century, obsessed with science and technology, reimagined Stonehenge as an astronomical computer. The counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s turned it into a symbol of cosmic consciousness and rejected modernity. Each of these interpretations tells us more about the interpreters than about the monument. The medievals saw magic because they lived in a magical world. The Romantics saw nature worship because they yearned for connection with nature. The astronomers saw a calculator because they lived in an age of calculation. We see what we are prepared to see. So what does our generation see? We see DNA. We see population genetics. We see migration replacement and the unsettling fragility of cultures that seem permanent. We see the deep past, not as a stable foundation, but as a series of upheavals, each one wiping the slate and starting over. We see ourselves reflected in the story of a people who built something magnificent and were, then forgotten. And we wonder whether the same thing could happen to us. This is not a comfortable reflection. We live in an age of unprecedented material abundance and technological power. We build skyscrapers and space stations and particle accelerators. We communicate instantaneously across the globe. We have mapped the human genome and photographed black holes. We are, by any historical measure, the most capable civilization that has ever existed. But the Neolithic farmers of Britain might have said something similar. They had transformed their world. They had tamed the forest. They had built monuments that would last for millennia. They were connected to communities hundreds of miles away. They had knowledge of astronomy, engineering, and material science that exceeded anything the preceding Mesolithic hunter-gatherers could have imagined. They were in their own terms at the peak of human achievement, and they were gone within a few generations. The parallel is not exact. Modern civilizations have advantages that the Neolithic farmers did not, including literacy, technology, and awareness of history itself. But the underlying dynamic that civilizations can be resilient and dominant for centuries, then collapse with startling speed, is a recurring pattern in human history. And the Stonehenge story is one of the most vivid illustrations of that pattern we have. The stones don't care who built them. They don't care who worships them, who photographs them, who interprets them, or who claims them. They just stand there as they have stood for 5,000 years, while empires rise and fall, and cultures bloom and wither around them. The people who built Stonehenge put something into the world that would outlast everything else they created. Every song, every prayer, every relationship, every belief, every moment of joy, or grief, or wonder, all of it has been swallowed by time. Only the stones remain, standing in a field in Wiltshire, facing the winter sunset, waiting for someone to remember what they meant. Nobody has remembered yet. Maybe nobody ever will. But the stones are patient. They have been waiting for 5,000 years, and they will be waiting long after we are gone too. The builders of Stonehenge left Britain 1,000 years before the Celts arrived. Nobody knows where they went, but they left behind the only message that mattered. A message carved not in words, but in stone. A message that says, we were here, we were real, and we built something that would not be forgotten, even if we were. And that right there is the story of Stonehenge. Not the simple version you were taught in school, not the Druids and Celts fairy tale that has been repeated for 300 years. The real story. The one with farmers from France and stones from Wales and DNA from the steppe, and a civilization that vanished so completely that it took 5,000 years and a revolution in genetics to find them again. The question of where the builders went may never be answered. The question of why they disappeared may never be fully understood. But the question of whether they mattered, that one is easy. They mattered. They built something eternal. And now finally, after 5 millennia of silence and misattribution and forgetting, the world is starting to pay attention. The stones stand. The builders are gone. The mystery endures. And if that doesn't make you want to subscribe, I don't know what will. One last thought. If you ever visit Stonehenge, don't go in summer. Go on a grey morning in December, when the tourists are thin on the ground, and the wind is cutting across the plain, and the sky is the colour of old pewter. Stand at the entrance to the avenue, and look southwest, toward the gap between the tallest trilithons. That is where the mid-inter sun sets. That is the alignment that mattered most. And when you stand there, remember that you are standing where they stood. The people who cleared the forest and ploughed the chalk, the people who buried their dead in the Aubrey holes and walked the processional route from Durrington Walls to the river and up the avenue to the stones, the people who quarried duorite in the Welsh mountains and dragged it across 150 miles of prehistoric Britain because they believed those stones were sacred enough to justify the impossible effort. They stood where you are standing. They saw what you are seeing. The same sky, the same horizon, the same sun dropping behind the same stones on the shortest day of the year. The only difference is that we know their story now, even if we don't know their names. And that has to count for something. 5,000 years of anonymity is a long time, but it might finally be coming to an end. The stones still stand, the mystery remains, and the builders, wherever they went, are no longer completely forgotten.